All right, guys. This is the last video for the second week, which is on language. Super short set of notes. Again, language is a very very small topic overall. It almost always gets lumped in with the thinking part of things because language is, again, you're constantly recalling memory and language that you've used, or that you've learned to use. So it usually gets lumped in with those, but only about 6 or 7 slides to go over, so shouldn't be too long. Anyway, language, and my ugly mug is covering up the definition there, but um, basically it's just basically a form of communication that uses spoken and written words and gestures that are combined according to specific rules. Basically, and by the way, language doesn't always have to be spoken or written. You can have body language, you can have facial expressions. It's just the communication of ideas, thoughts, feelings, experiences. Language allows you to do that. Language is it's a very obviously we could spend so much more time on language overall. In terms of psychology, though, it's kind of small, but the idea of language itself incredibly fascinating. Linguistics is the study of language. So, um, obviously, if this is something that's interesting to you, then then there's all kinds of ways to go in more depth. But for psychology, we kind of stay very basic, um, and we don't get very deep into it. But again, again, the form of communication, it's spoken, written, nonverbal, verbal ways that we combine them all together in order according to specific rules, and every language kind of has its own rules. If you've ever tried to learn another language, you know that. But it's what allows us to communicate our thoughts, our ideas, our beliefs, our feelings, emotions, all that stuff. um, so the two basic building blocks of language are what's called phonemes and morphemes, and these are can be confused, but I'll try to give you a trick to learn it, or to keep them straight. So phonemes are the smallest distinct unit of sound in a word, or in language as a whole. So they approximately 44 in the English language, but it's just the smallest unit of sound. Um, in any word. The p sound in party, the ing sound in ping. It's just, again, just sound. And then morphemes are the smallest unit of meaning. And sometimes they can be a word themselves, and sometimes they can be parts, such as prefixes or suffixes. Um, and again, you look at unbreakable, unkindness. Those are three. Both of them have three. They have a prefix, they have the root word, and then they have the suffix. But those have meaning. Okay, so this the smallest use, or the smallest meaning in language. The units of meaning are morphemes. The way I remember it, and this may be predating most of y'all, but there used to be something called Hooked on Phonics, which was like this program that helped kids who were having trouble, like learning how to read, be able to read easier, and it focused on using, being able to pronunciate sounds correctly, and using those to help you understand reading. So, and it used the sound. So phonemes, I always think of phonics, phonemes, phonics, and I think of sound. And then morphemes, and again, I remember just morphemes, morpheme starts with M, meaning starts with M. There you go. At least that's how I always remember it. It's not the greatest memory trick, but that's kind of how I go about things. So there's that. Syntax is just the rules for putting words in the correct order. Um, and sentences are constructed around um, syntax, the rules of syntax. So how we construct sentences in the English language is based on English syntax, whereas the way that Spanish or other languages are put together is based on the rules for their language. For example, When we are talking about a noun and an adjective to describe that noun in the English language, we put the adjective before the noun. So if we were describing something as being a big house, then, big, the adjective goes before the noun of house. That's the way syntax is in the English language. But in like Spanish, you say the adjective after the noun. So when you're talking about a big house, you say, uh, you know, uh, it would be like house big, casa grande, okay, for Spanish. You know, first the noun first, then the adjective, because that's what the syntax rules say for that language. Um, Again, every language kind of has its own rules, but it's the grammatical rules for putting them in the correct order. Now, grammar, which I don't really have as a definition on here, grammar is just the use of like the rules for the like punctuation and the rules for language themselves, or the rules for you know characteristics of that language. So capitalization, punctuation, those kind of things are grammar, not syntax. Syntax is just order of words, whereas grammar is um, everything else. Okay, a couple theories on language development. So Chomsky, if you've ever heard of him, Noam Chomsky, he's kind of like what Freud is to, you know, certain areas of psychology. He is that to language development. He is very well regarded. But he has a theory that basically says that we learn language, or that all human beings are born with the ability to learn any language. It's just that we tend to, obviously, what we're with the society and family and culture that we were born into dictates the language that we learn. However, he believes we have an innate ability to learn and produce any speech, any language, and his evidence to this is that, if you look at all of these different cultures and that speak all these different languages all throughout the world, all of them tend to have very similar maturation processes in that language. We all tend to get to, or each language tends to have very similar milestones that kids or that infants, toddlers, and kids reach as they learn language. And so he believes that we all have what he called a language acquisition device, that we have kind of innately in us, that allows us to learn excuse me, allows us to learn any language, or that we all have the ability to learn any language. That doesn't mean that we can learn and that we will learn any language. It just means that, we could learn any language. It's not necessarily that if you're born in the United States, you have a tendency to only learn English or whatever. That's not what it means. It just means that we all have the ability to learn any language based on this language acquisition device that we are born with, according to Chomsky. Now, this one is kind of an interesting theory. Some people don't really put too much emphasis or put too much faith in it, but it's really interesting. It's called the theory of linguistic determinism, or linguistic relativity, and it was proposed by this guy named Benjamin Whorf, who he believed that the language that we learn and use influences the thoughts that we have, not the other way around. In other words, there are certain, and his evidence was that there are certain patterns within languages that can shape our thoughts and perceptions, according to Whorf's theory, rather than our thoughts and perceptions shaping language. His evidence for this is that there, basically, he a couple things. He said if you look at certain cultures like Eskimo culture, Eskimo culture has a lot of different words for snow. In other words, they have different words and definitions for different types of snow. Whereas, Western culture, like, think about North Carolina, like we have basically snow. That's it. That's just what, Doesn't matter if it's big flakes, small flakes, it's just snow. Um, because that's what we think of it as. Like we just think of it as snow. Whereas Eskimos who are always around snow, they have very different because of their language that has all these different words for it. They think about it in a different way than we do in Western culture. Also, he used examples of certain languages having very specific rules that can affect thoughts. For example, he points out that the Hopi Indians do not have a past tense in their use of verbs, so they rarely acknowledge, or even within their culture everywhere, they rarely have any reference to the past. It's only the present and the future because that's the way that their verbs are constructed. So, because of that, he's saying that the reason they don't have a lot of acknowledgement to the past is because they literally don't think about the past the same way that you and I do because they don't have the same language for the past. Again, it's kind of an out there theory, but I can see how it would make sense. And then lastly, and this is just kind of something they throw on every year, is do animals possess language, the ability for language? And I don't think there is that you will get zero argument from me that the animals don't communicate. They absolutely communicate, um, but they do not communicate with language. Language, again, if you go back to the definition, spoken and written words and gestures in order to communicate. I can get the gestures part. Animals can use those, and I can get the sounds and stuff, but that's not spoken and written language. So they have their own forms, I guess you could say, kind of primitive forms of communication and language, but they don't, in my opinion, they do not have the ability like human ability of language. But I mean, I absolutely 100% believe that animals communicate, but I do not think they have the ability to learn human language. And usually I have somebody in class who points out, well, my dog knows when I say sit or roll over or whatever. Well, yeah, but they know that sound, that sound that they hear over and over again just means that if they do something, they get rewarded or whatever. It doesn't mean they literally hear the word sit and think, oh, that means I put my bottom on the floor. That's not what they're thinking. They just know if I do this, this is what comes afterward. They just know the sound. Again, I've had people argue with me up and down over the years that animals use language, and I just don't see it. But anyway, I think that's it. Yep, that's it. So that's it for language. That's it for this unit. That's it for this week. In terms of notes and videos, I will see you next week when we get into intelligence and motivation. Have a good rest of your week. Whenever you're watching this weekend, and I'll see you next week.